We'll get this started then. All right, so anyone who's attending, this is now being recorded, so please exit if you don't want to be recorded. And without further ado, I guess we'll start this is the third EXALT Dialogue of 2024. And, EXALT is the global extractivisms and alternatives to it. This initiative in general is meant to expand research, conversations, and with it, in this case, dialogues on pretty much any and everything related to extractivism, and most importantly, its alternatives to it. But today we have a very interesting and excellent panel. We're actually going to be delving into Ireland. We're going country specific today because it's been brought to my attention that Ireland is on the forefront, in my words, in manufacturing digital utopias and various forms of different extractivisms. So today we'll be looking at a cross-sector of how all these different extractivisms are intersecting, from wind turbines to data centers to mines to forestry extraction. And I believe there's probably some things I'm forgetting right now, but I'm rather excited and enthusiastic to actually kind of hear about some of these multi-sector entanglements in terms of, ultimately how Ireland is kind of on the forefront of rolling these things out, even if it's not necessarily just limited to Ireland. So without further ado, let's begin this EXALT dialogue by hearing from Patrick Brody and getting into looking what our lovely participants have to say here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sander. And thanks for putting it, getting us together and stuff. It's been a really great opportunity to get us all in a Zoom room to kind of talk about these things together. So let me just share my screen here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for about 7-8 minutes or so, and then I'll hand it over to Patty before handing it over to Vincenza and Louise. Okay, so can everybody see my screen okay? Is it presenter view or?
Yeah, it looks good.
Looks
Can
good.
see it.
Okay.
It's not the biggest version. It's kind of shows us your.
Just
Yeah, perfect.
yeah, better. Okay, awesome. Cool. Sweet. So yeah, what we're going to do in this presentation is kind of give a broad overview of some of the work that Patty Bresnahan and I have been doing together over the past, I always forget, like 6 years, 5 years at this point, around the intersections between digital infrastructure and energy transitions in Ireland. And specifically, we'll talk a little bit about how that has been playing out in terms of these dynamics of green extractivism across Ireland, right? Kind of at this intersection between big tech, data centers, and these emerging regimes of extractivism. So where I come at this specifically to give some kind of context is I'm a media studies scholar, and I think that there has been a kind of push in the last few years in relation to and in kind of understanding the expansion of digital technologies and, especially the kind of increasing heralding or warning about their environmental impacts, to focus on the kind of functionally energetic processes of electronic media, right? So whether we're looking all the way back at the telegraph cable, or in the case of in some of Patty and I's work, we've looked at early radio communication in Ireland, built by Giuliano Marconi in the West. He built a radio station that was powered by turf cut from the local bog, burned in order to power this electronic, kind of invention, right? That would fire signals across the Atlantic through the quote unquote ether, right? And we've become interested in the ways that this actually kind of tells us a lot about the emerging recognition of these necessary energetic connections and kind of energy infrastructures that are becoming extremely, extremely important to digital industries, right? And one of our points is that they kind of always have been, right? Although we're currently seeing these, kind of increasing turns towards policy frameworks around the green digital transition, digitalization, and decarbonisation as twin transitions. These are not necessarily new, kind of things that must operate together. just in terms of the basic, electrical requirements of electronic media from, the kind of from the beginnings. But this is also increasingly demonstrating a kind of logic that at its kind of functional level is irreconcilable with environmental justice in any kind of meaningful way, right? Because if you are going to transition away from fossil fuels, if you are going to, decarbonize society in any kind of wide-reaching and, again, environmentally just way, you actually cannot continue growing this extremely extractive sector of the economy at the same time, right? That is premised on profit-driven growth. And Patty will talk more specifically about that in a minute. But the way that I kind of come at this is, but in media studies, this is we're kind of turning against this idea that this is somehow this atmospheric, the cloud is existing somewhere else, right? Digital capitalism is, somehow cleaner than earlier modes of production, right? As folks like Maximilian Young, as well as others, a great many others have been focusing on, there is actually, beyond mineral extraction, there is also a kind of extractive logic that's at the heart of digital capitalism. And one of the ways that this gets talked about, especially in the kind of mainstream and industry presses, is through these resource metaphors, right? What is data? If this is the new oil, if it is the quote unquote oxygen of the fourth industrial revolution, as it's referred to, right? Then what is the kind of resource logic that is at play here, right? And a lot of people talk about how, these big tech companies rely on these sophisticated forms of data extraction, right? The extraction of data from everyday life, which they then use and process and analyze and, sell things back and, use to, function as a core function of, a lot of their processes, right? And this is, of course, an extractive logic, and it comes with kind of expanded forms of material extraction, again, from mineral extraction to the forms of, energy as well as water usage that is required to run these infrastructures. But that's not necessarily connected as much in the kind of discussions around data extraction as, like people are doing work, including Xander, obviously, and stuff that I'm sure will be familiar to a lot of folks in this room, in this Zoom room here. There's of course a lot of people who are focusing on the expanding extractive footprints and, the kind of unfolding, extractive epistemologies of, green, climate smart extractivism, right? However you want to call it. In the form of, again, minerals, renewable energy, lower carbon energy technologies and things like this, right? So, one of our kind of key examples that we use, and again, Patty will talk a little bit about the kind of specifics of Ireland here in a minute, but is the looking at the direct and overt connections between the energy transition and data centers in Ireland, right? And the ways that that is kind of extremely instructive into the imbalanced geographies of the energy transition that are mapping onto these much, kind of more durable, enduring forms of geographical inequality that, kind of structure Ireland's environmental relationships, let's say. Again, Patty will talk more about this in a minute. But so this here, is the base of a wind turbine that this wind farm, as it was being built, was the cause of a massive, massive peat slide, dislodged thousands of tons of peat from the hillside here in the construction of an access road to, get the trucks up to stick these turbines in place. And this wind farm is partnered with which is in Donegal. It's in the border region, its own, kind of site of abandonment. It's very much a kind of sacrifice zone for various extractive industries. And this placed up in this, kind of pocket of Ireland was 90 megawatts of power that was going to be used to power data center, Amazon Web Services data centers 200 plus kilometers away in Dublin, right? And so this, there was a localized objection campaign. People were recognizing the kind of wider connections that this wind farm had with Ireland's, kind of digital economy and its, kind of foreign direct investment regime. But at the same time, it was very much dismissed, right? Because wind energy, renewable electricity, these infrastructures are seen as a good thing, right? They're seen as something that is, part of the climate transition, and this is Amazon's way of giving back and, helping Ireland do it, right? But at the same time, as soon as the peat slide happens, Amazon disappears from the conversation, and in fact, literally disappears from some headlines around it because they said this is actually not our wind farm. We are just in a contract that this is the responsibility of someone else, right? So again, this is kind of an instructive example of the ways in which this plays out across these, kind of existing unequal geographical and ecological relationships. So I'll turn it over to Patty here in a minute. And so basically where we're coming at this from is that we're interested in what broadly is at stake in enabling and deepening these ways that big tech and datafication more broadly are organizing ecologies deeper towards these regimes of digital capital accumulation. And this is not about these particular environmental impacts of digital technologies, right? As much as you can see the impact of this wind turbine, right, and their infrastructures, it's what we're more interested in is the emergence and management of these unfolding frontiers at the intersection of green and digital capitalism. And this is the vision, especially here in Ireland, of eco-modernity that is becoming increasingly hegemonic and difficult to, kind of politically mobilize against. And this is, it's not just Ireland, this is happening elsewhere. But we are also interested in why Ireland has become such a hotspot as things like, as many people I'm sure have seen in the headlines, the energy and general kind of resource impacts of AI are going to continue to compound these issues. So I'll turn it over to Patty here for the last.
Thanks, Pat. I was enjoying that. If I could just sit here and listen to you keep talking. Right, so I'm gonna, so Pat's laid out some of that groundwork around, why I'm thinking about green extractivism. We really have to link it with an analysis of digital capitalism and big tech. So I'm going to zoom in on Ireland, where most of our work has really been taking place. And in like 7 or 8 minutes, that's not a lot of time. So I think that the strategy here is to just throw some things on the table, not go into them in a lot of depth, but then maybe in the Q&A and the discussion where we have a bit more time, they can be picked up again and people can come back to it, or we can try and elaborate it on a bit more. So to start with, I think it's really important to sort of highlight just the scale of data center growth and the intensity of data center growth in Ireland and its energy requirement. So CSO, which is the Central Statistics Office, last year, so these are the latest figures, but they would have come up by now, so this is from 2023, is that data centers, there's about 82 data centers, operating data centers at the moment. They make up about 18% of the electricity on the grid from last year. That is estimated, depending on different figures, but the International Energy Agency is the sort of starkest figure, which is that by 2026 it's going to be more like 30% of electricity on the grid. So in a very short amount of time. I think that those figures become more startling when you compare it to, say, our next, a country that is sort of next in rank in terms of the intensity of data center growth and energy, and that's Denmark. So if you look at those figures down at the bottom, also from the IEA, Denmark are currently, there's about 4% of electricity on the grid is used by data centers, and that's forecast to go up to about 7%. So, I mean, these are colossal figures, like 30%, third of the electricity on the grid, at a time when, we are supposed to be decarbonizing, and decarbonizing is not just about expanding, energy supply. It's also about reducing demand. It's about, in a kind of a systematic way. So these are the kinds of contradictions that exist in Ireland. And I think over the last 5 years, what Pat and I have been interested in is how those contradictions, which have only been intensifying, you can move to the next slide actually, Pat, are being managed and mediated. And this is where, we come at this point of Ireland being this sort of laboratory for green tech energy transition, this twin transition, as Pat outlined at the beginning. So how is it that the Irish state, through semi-state companies, through other organs of the state, including universities and research bodies. How is it working closely with the tech industry and with the energy industry in order to sort of mediate and negotiate these contradictions? And effectively, how is it turning this colossal energy demand and infrastructural demand of a particular sector into a supposed benefit? Because that's effectively what we're talking about. So some of what I won't go into a lot of detail here, but some of the kinds of solutions we're talking about are, as Pat outlined with that wind farm in Donegal, so there are financial contracts, so tech companies enter into corporate power purchase agreements with wind farms or solar farms. Those are not particularly novel, they've been around for decades. But in Ireland, they've only started since 2019 and were very much sort of initiated or instigated around the tech sector. So that's one aspect of it, but in a kind of a blunt way, I'd say. Other ways which are kind of more interesting in a way to look at are the ways in which data centers, because they are such large energy consumers and because they have such sort of large infrastructural capacity, the ways in which they're positioning themselves as sort of necessary infrastructure for a decarbonised grid. So if the grid needs to take on more and more unpredictable alternative forms of energy like solar and wind, that grid needs to be a lot faster and a lot more adaptive and flexible in terms of how it manages supply and demand. So data centers are positioning themselves, and the tech sector more generally, as a necessary infrastructure for managing that flexible demand and supply. So Microsoft, for example, you see down there, using data centers as batteries, basically, to draw down energy and to put it back up on the grid. And those services, which are sort of demand side services, can be monetized. So it's not just that data centers are being good energy citizens, as they're described often in media and policy, but they are looking to monetize these types of services and activities they can do. So we're kind of at a situation where that article headline at the top, where sort of limiting the growth of data centers is now being seen as a way of limiting Ireland's ability to meet climate targets and to decarbonize our energy sector. And this has happened in a very short amount of time, this complete flip. And so data centers, if you want to move to the next slide, Pat, data centers and the tech sector are basically becoming more and more like utilities in the Irish context. So not just they have the odd wind farm or the odd solar farm, they're becoming more and more insinuated into the actual grid. And that raises much bigger questions in a way beyond emissions or energy footprints, back to this idea of kind of organizing ecologies and organizing infrastructures. And so a kind of a particular example, recent example that I think is interesting in this kind of argument is this eco-energy park. And again, there's nothing particularly novel about these green industrial parks. I'm sure people in the Zoom room will have seen them in other contexts. What we have here is Bord na Móna, which is a semi-state company that is responsible for Ireland's peatlands. So it had initially developed the turf industry or peat industry going back to the 1930s. And since 2021, it's rebranded itself as a climate solutions company. And so effectively, it's a semi-state company that sort of its prerogative is to be a commercial company and to make a revenue or to make a profit off its assets. And really its assets are land, peatlands. And in the Midlands of Ireland, you have large sort of thousands of acres of these peatlands, which have been drained and mined over decades. And Bord na Móna sort of owns and manages them. And one of the models it's looking towards for future development is this eco-energy park. And the eco-energy park is effectively a kind of a closed zone where you would have a co-location of alternative energy infrastructures like wind turbines with battery storage and data centers. So a kind of automated closed loop of infrastructures that are owned by energy companies and by tech companies, a kind of a laboratory in a kind of literal sense for this twinned transition. And what's interesting about this eco-energy park is that it raises all sorts of questions around the kind of jurisdiction and the governance of energy. Because in order for this sort of siloed sort of enclave of energy and data to operate, there will likely have to be changes to energy regulation in Ireland, which go back to the 20s when our public utility was created, in order to allow for these privatized sort of microgrids to operate. So effectively what we're seeing is a kind of a siloing off of resources and infrastructures away from the sort of messy sort of public grid and the sort of obligations of a public energy sector. So maybe if you want to go to the next slide, Pat, and pushing this further, which is a lot of what Pat and I have been doing for 5 years, and we kind of have this like unenviable position of being like, this is going to happen, we know this is going to happen, and then there's a report in the news about it happening, in terms of how tech and energy are just becoming more and more, enfolded into one another. So the next sort of frontier, if you want to call it, of this sort of green tech energy extractivism is the offshore. And Ireland has a huge offshore wind potential, and it's constantly sort of being talked about, and Ireland is sort of mentioned as being the sort of Saudi Arabia of offshore wind energy. And in that context, data centers, which are a huge energy consumer, are kind of very much joined to that. And in fact, we see these arguments coming that in order for Ireland to develop its offshore wind energy, we need data centers to grow, because we basically need a way to draw that energy down. That data centers can effectively become ways of transforming excess offshore wind energy into data services, which can then be exported. So they function as a way of sort of processing excess offshore wind energy, which would otherwise be lost. And so we also see things like down here at the Echelon Data Centre, which is just last week got planning permission down in the southeast of Ireland. They've built or they're building a substation on their sort of in their land and in their development, which will be where electricity lands from offshore wind farms on the southeast of the country. So when that energy is brought on shore, it will be processed through a substation, which is owned by a data center on data center land. So it's another example of how data centers are positioning themselves as essential infrastructure for the transition, which raises all sorts of questions about who owns that, who benefits from that, and also the sort of the strategies of how they can profit from these kinds of infrastructural arrangements. So next slide, Pat. There's quite a lot of laying out, and I just had this slide here because it's quite important, and we can come back to it later. But it's this question of why Ireland. So why is Ireland a laboratory for this kind of green tech, data, energy developments? And I'm sure it'll come through in Vicenza and Louise's talks as well. Because we get asked this question a lot, why are there so many data centers in Ireland? And the only way to answer that question is to go back in history and to think about Ireland's development trajectory across colonial and then post-colonial periods. And specifically to think about that in the context of dependency and Ireland's sort of peripheral or semi-peripheral position within the world capitalist system. So very briefly, what that looks like, if we only go back 50 years in time, is that from the 1950s, 60s, Ireland pivoted from an economic development policy or strategy that was around import substitution, national protectionism, sort of developing indigenous resources, rural modernization, a lot of these kinds of policies that were not in any sense socialist, but are kind of familiar in other former colonial contexts. So if you think about when countries get independence, there's an effort to de-link somewhat from the imperial core and the former colonizer. So that happened in Ireland in the 30s, 40s, 50s. But from the 50s and 60s onwards, there was a really dramatic pivot where Ireland sought to reintegrate into the world economy, particularly under the influence of the US after World War II, and also the EEC and Europe and entering into that. And because Ireland had this proximity to the US and Europe, its transition from a kind of national protectionist to a very liberal open economy was much more rapid than in other contexts. And what that meant was Ireland was looking to attract multinational corporations to the country, to locate, to set up facilities in order to export their products. And that looks like these ads, which are from the 70s, which are kind of amusing in some ways, but they were, a kind of a very aggressive policy, largely led through the IDA, the Industrial Development Authority, to attract companies here. A lot of that was through financial incentives and tax breaks, and we know Ireland is a tax haven. But an argument that Pat and I make, and this is looking through the history of foreign direct investment in the country, is that it was also through infrastructure and environmental conditions. So in order to attract these industries here, a lot of them needed water infrastructure, energy, they needed access to sinks, and Ireland was well positioned to sort of provide those resources and those environmental conditions. And what we're seeing today with data centers and their sort of energy requirement and the ways in which infrastructures are being developed for them is really a continuation of that and an intensification of that. And why that I think is an important argument, if you want to go to the last slide, Pat, is in thinking about the politics of all of this and the stakes of all of this. And so this is the title of the book that Pat and I are working on, where we tease out a lot of these things in more detail. But the key arguments are that Ireland is this sort of laboratory for new kinds of infrastructural and ecological governance at a time of the transition, this twin transition. The kinds of forms of green extractivism this is giving rise to, everything from wind farms to these eco-energy parks, to mining. There is a spatially uneven geography within Ireland, but it's also important to think about where Ireland fits within these globalized supply chains. So there is these like multi-scalar geographies at play. And it's obviously very important then in any work that we're doing as researchers or activists is to think and work to link up these very diverse forms of extractivism and how they are part of this sort of extensive supply chains and infrastructures of this eco-modernist transition. And so just some examples that I think you can point to maybe learn from are No Tech for Apartheid, which is obviously linked, the kind of developments of particular software and hardware in the likes of Google and Microsoft, these big tech companies, with what that looks like in places like Gaza and Palestine, particularly in the context of the ongoing genocide there. So connecting up these different sites and different kinds of subjects, like workers for these companies, with those who are being directly affected by these kinds of automated forms of warfare. So that's one example. And then coming back to our own context in Ireland and thinking about what Vicenza and Louise are going to talk about, I think a key argument or point is about thinking about how land-based struggles are central to the contestation of green tech capitalism. And that isn't an obvious point to make. When people think about green tech or Google or Amazon, you don't immediately think about Leitrim or Donegal or places that are at the periphery, but it's often in these places that the extractive frontiers and supply chains of these industries are hitting the ground and are being resisted. And in Ireland particularly, as this photo shows, those sites of contestation have much longer histories of struggle against colonialism and against capitalism. And there's a very interesting way in which those histories and sort of networks as well can play a part in what's happening today and also into the future. So I think I'll leave it there, and hopefully that bridges a little bit to what Vicenza and Louise are going to talk about.
All right. Amazing. Loving this. I mean, it's really sad and heavy and really depressing material, but you're actually really showing a lot of really important intersections here. And maybe to make up for my bad introductions, Patrick Brodie is at the School of Information and Communication Studies, University of Dublin. And then Patrick Brenshaw, excuse me for mispronouncing your name, is in the Department of Geography at Maynooth University. So we got to hear from them. And I just can't stress enough the way you're kind of pointing out these intersections are really important. And I think there's more to even get into and unpack in some of these intersections. Like, I think Patrick Brody was getting at with kind of looking at the bog slide and things like this. But this gives us a great opportunity to move into Vicenza, who's a PhD colleague at the Galway University, who I think will be getting into talking about a little bit some of the mining issues in Ireland. So you're up, and look forward to hearing it.
Great. Thank you, Sander. Can you see that okay now? Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about mining and green extractivism in Ireland. And yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. Great to be part of the EXALT series because it's really inspired my work actually over the years. So yeah, great to be here. My activism and academic work looks at resistance movements to extractivism from a decolonial and feminist perspective. And yeah, I'm trying to finish up my PhD at the minute, which is in Galway University. And I'm hoping to submit next week. So my brain is very fuzzy at the minute. So I really hope that I can present something coherent to you guys today. But yeah, great to be part of the conversation. I just wanted to say as well that I organise with an amazing collective called CAIM, which stands for Communities Against the Injustice of Mining, which is a grassroots network of communities resisting mining across Ireland. And I'm going to talk about that today as well. And I'm also part of a couple of international solidarity networks, which are trying to push back against sort of, yeah, the extractive frontier and green extractivism more broadly. One is the Making Relatives Collective, and the other is the Zapatista Solidarity Network. So I'm going to speak a little bit about them as well, if that's okay. But I'm going to focus in on mining in Ireland with a special focus on the Sperrin Mountains, which is where my research looks at. So I just wanted to locate that for you guys. It's up here in the northwest of the island, and you can see here in the zoom in that there is a proposed very, very large gold mine by a North American company called Agrarian for this area, and it's very close to a village called Greencastle. And I'm going to get into that case study a little bit later on. I just wanted to show you where that is. And the area actually that Pat was talking about where this landslide happened is just across the border from the Sperrin Mountains here in Donegal. And I'm going to touch on that as well because it's very important in terms of like the transboundary aspect and the kind of sacrifice zones around the border that feed into this discussion very much so as well. And yeah, I just also wanted to mention that my work looks at the kind of the coloniality of extractive logics. And I think this is very important when you're talking about the north of Ireland, which has its own very unique context to consider in all of this as well. So I'm from the north of Ireland, and my research is mainly here. And yeah, so I guess it could be called Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland. It's yeah, the naming is very political here as well. But while we can talk about maybe, you know, the post-colonial regime of the South, I don't think we can talk about that in the North. You know, there's still very colonial in many ways. So I think that's just important context to keep in mind for the differences that play out across different areas of the island. And I also want to stress throughout the presentation, you know, the ways that communities are resisting this as well. You know, they're not just passive victims in all of this. But yeah, I wanted to start with some context on the sort of political economy of mining in Ireland, north and south. And I wanted to highlight that, you know, the Yes Life Node and Mining Network has pointed out that Ireland is a hotspot in the European mining boom, along with areas of the Iberian Peninsula and Scandinavia. And we know that 25% of the land in the north and around 27% of the land in the south has already been concessioned for mineral prospecting. And this is really in contrast to other parts of the UK. So like we've got 7% of Scotland, 6% of Wales, and only 0.2% of England. So there's like quite a big difference there. And we know that the targets are copper, cobalt, zinc, lead, lithium, and gold. But gold is very much a very big kind of area in this. And we know that about 91% of all of the prospecting licenses across the island are for gold. And I don't think I need to tell this audience, but it's very hard to justify new gold mines whenever we know that 60% goes to jewelry and only about 12% goes into like industry demand. And we know there's like already so much dug up that we can use to meet like industry demand and needs. So yeah, within what's happening in Ireland, there's very strong narratives of green extractivism and the need for extractivism to meet this green transition. So I wanted to just go back a little bit as well to what Paddy had touched on about the sort of restructuring of the Irish economy towards a very neoliberal outlook. And yeah, from like the 1960s, that's whenever we start to see modern mining really emerging in the south of Ireland. And I really recommend reading Conor McCabe's work. The Sins of Our Father is a brilliant book if you want to understand the Irish economy. And he highlights that there was like mining acts in 1957 and then in 1967. Which meant, and he says, that Canadian companies had been given Ireland's mineral resources effectively for free. And we see mainly Canadian and also Swedish companies coming to Ireland at that time and opening like these very big projects. In the north, a slightly different story because of the Troubles, the conflict here. This mining, modern mining couldn't develop at the time because the use of explosives was really difficult. So we see from like the 2000s, more kind of like modern mining emerging then instead. And I really recommend these two reports. The first one is by Linda Sullivan, who is an amazing activist, member of CAIM and Save Our Sperrins, and works with the Yes to Life Node Mining Network. And she's detailed a lot of what's happening around mining in Ireland in this report, which you can find online. And then the second report is by Conor McCabe, and it's really important in understanding the North's political economy and how what we see is a double transition happening. So we see a transition towards peace and neoliberalism. And we see this kind of like how those two things are tied up together. And I think this is very common in many post-conflict situations. And, there's the quote, do the keys to peace open the doors to extractivism? And I think that very much applies in the north of Ireland. So yeah, these are just some kind of contextual things to be aware of. And as the north has sort of like developed after the conflict, we've moved into like an extremely extractive economy, and we see like very intense in other areas as well. We see intense factory farming. We see like the dredging of Lough Neagh, which has led to a huge ecological disaster, which is ongoing. We see lots of different aspects going on too. But yeah, we see that communities are calling this out, and they're saying that mining needs to be and the communities that are being sacrificed need to be centered in like discussions around just transition. But what we see happening is even like the mainstream environmental NGOs in Ireland not really taking mining on as an issue, even though it's one of the most pressing environmental and social issues I think happening on the island. And just to sort of talk about how facilitative both states are to the mining industry, we see the PDAC conference in Canada, one of the biggest mining conferences in the world, has an Ireland Open for Business forum every year, where we see politicians from the north and south go over and promote Ireland. And they often use, I don't know if you can see here, they often use maps without any borders on it. And you also see unionist politicians who would be very like, we're British, we're with the UK, they go and they promote Ireland as this one, so whenever capital's involved, the ideology kind of gets left behind. But yeah, so this is like, one of the ways that like state bodies are kind of facilitating this. And we also know that the on the Fraser Institute, which kind of rank companies' attractiveness to mining. Ireland is often ranked in first, second. They're always kind of like in the top 10 rankings as well. Over the years. And we know that, yeah, in the north, for example, there's been a couple of university programs and projects being run to sort of what's been called considering the responsible mineral resources in Northern Ireland, you know, where resistance groups have called out this as kind of like research to you know, find like the social acceptability of mining and gain a social license to operate. And yeah, just to talk a little bit as well about the colonial legacies that are at play here. So the Crown Estate still owns the precious metals in the north of Ireland. So any mine that opens, they would gain 4% royalties. And this is a picture of us protesting with the London Mining Network and Yes Life Node mining groups in London in 2021 outside the Crown Estate's office when we did like a big trip around London protesting at different headquarters and government departments. We also know that for example, like with Lough Neagh and the ecological disaster unfolding there, the bed is still owned by the Earl of Shaftesbury, and there's been a lot of campaigning around that you can look into as well, which talks to sort of like the ongoing colonial presence on the island. And yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit now about CAIM, which is Communities Against the Injustice of Mining. And CAIM was set up in February 2021. And it's a really amazing group of communities across the island. And it's like a peer-to-peer support network. So the communities are sharing knowledge and skills and helping each other resist plans in their areas. Some communities are resisting the expansion of already existing mines. Some are resisting prospecting licenses, and others are resisting applications for mines like the ones in the Sperrins. And this would be like the slogan of the movement, which means there's no strength without unity. And yeah, it kind of speaks to the solidarity that's kind of formed there. And then the name itself, CAIM, it also is a really important older Irish word, which means a circle of protection for your community of humans and more than humans. So that's why we chose the name, because of its special significance. And these are just some pictures from the climate camp where CAIM was a very big part of, that was held on the shores of Lough Neagh in August recently. And you can follow CAIM on social media, and there's also a website with lots of great information as well if anyone wants to be kind of kept up to date on what's happening there. Yeah, and this is just a list of some of the member groups, about 10 member groups. And as you can see, they're in like all different parts of the island, like all across. But what's kind of common with mining and extractivism in Ireland is that it's like pushed to like the rural peripheries. Yes, and also I'm going to talk a little bit more about the international solidarity aspect, but I just wanted to highlight a recent visit we had from people from the Brazilian Amazon who are resisting bauxite mining, and they met with members of CAIM. This is Melina here from CAIM, who is involved in resisting a bauxite processing plant in the Shannon Estuary in County Clare. And it was like a really important solidarity sort of exchange between communities, because we think that the bauxite from their communities comes to Ireland to be processed here, and that's another huge issue for the communities that live around that processing plant. So yeah, just to talk a little bit more about my research in the Sperrin Mountains. So my research question really is, in what way are communities resisting extractivist logics in the Sperrin Mountains? And I kind of look at how, I guess, the logics of extractivism play out, but also how communities create kind of counter narratives or kind of push back against that by building different relationships with each other and the more than human world. So I can look at the relationships within the campaign itself, the more than human relations, and international solidarity relations too. And I draw on this feminist and decolonial perspective that sort of looks at, how these logics construct people and environments as sacrificable, really. And I love this quote by Leanne Bedasomasake Simpson, that the alternative to extractivism is deep reciprocity, it's respect, it's relationship, responsibility, and it's local. And I use a creative methodology and an activist methodology as well to try and counter kind of academic extractivism. And so these are just some pictures from doing the field work over the last five years. And some outputs from that you can find online, including exhibitions and a photo voice booklet that I produced with participants, where they've taken pictures of their experiences that we kind of published. It's online too. So just to give you some more context to the application in the Sperrins, which is currently the only live planning application on the island for a mine. And it's a huge project. It's really hard to get your head around like just the scale of this project. But the campaign produced this photo just to help people get their head around how massive it would be. So this building here is one of like the highest buildings in Dublin, and that is the height of the waste pile that they want to place less than a kilometre above a village in the Sperrin Mountains on top of a bog, which is like a moving landscape. So it would be uphill on this like unstable ground above playing fields, a school, all these different things. And the size, you can see it covers pretty much all of like the centre of Dublin there too. It's a lot. So just to give you an update about what's happening now with it, there's going to be a public inquiry in January now, we know, and Save Our Sperrins, which is one of the campaign groups which is resisting this project, have been trying to raise funds for this public inquiry. So if you would like to donate, you can find their crowdfunder online, and I'm sure anything at all is very, very much appreciated. But just to give you a little more information on the structure of Dalradian, the company, they were bought over by Orion Mining Finance, I think in 2018, which is a private equity mining firm. And then in November 2023, Wheaton Precious Metals, which is a royalty and streaming group, partially bought them over as well. So the kind of ultimate owner is Oscar Leonarski. And we know that the company, the sort of like Corporate Watch has done a big report into the fact that many of the directors and people involved have been involved in many other projects involving human rights abuses and environmental injustices across the world. So that's just some context on the plan in the Sperrins. But I think it's really important to understand like the colonial construction of land and people in Ireland, which goes back very, very far. This area around where they want to mine for gold in the Sperrins has been described as, wild, land of the worst kind, in need of great improvement. It's just bog, it's wasteland, in the way like, we construct like terra nullius, or this kind of empty wilderness that we can just justify extraction from. And we know that like during this time as well, this area was known as the wild and barbarous lands of people of Munterlony, which I think the resistance movement has reclaimed as kind of like a sign of respect, which I think is great as well. And just to note that this goes back so far, and I think this is from the 1100s. In the Topographia Hibernia, we see this reference to minerals as well, and the fact that the Irish were too lazy and barbarous and uncivilized to even bother cultivating their own minerals and mines, as another way to justify taking it in colonialism. And then I think about how this like follows through into like the modern day. And I draw on Macarena Gomez-Paris's brilliant work, and she talks about, the extractive gaze, which uses technologies to dispossess. And in Ireland at the minute, there's this TELUS project, which is mapping the entire country from the air. And when it's finished, they say that Ireland is going to be the most deeply mapped geologically country in the world. And this as well ties back to sort of colonial imagination, imaginings of the land, where mapping was very much developed in Ireland as a colonial technique and then exported around the world as a way to divorce relationships that people had with each other and with the land. Basically as a way to develop capitalism as well, and sort of like map the land into like economic units to make profit from. And as well, I love the story that in the 1500s, the Sir John Davies, who I think was the general, one of the Lord Deputy Generals of Ireland, he wrote in his diary how a map maker was sent to Tyrone, the area where the Sperrin Mountains are, to map the land, and the local people took off his head. So there was already this perception that, like, this is quite a dangerous thing, that this was like a reordering of like our social reality, and there was a resistance to it. And this came through very strongly in my research, where, participants like referenced quite often the kind of longer histories of oppression. Here's a reference to sort of the penal laws, where religion and language and different things were made illegal. And as well, they reference the fact that the company's CEO described the people in the area as just welly-wearing sheep farmers. And, this is something that was meant as an insult, but local people, take a lot of pride in the kind of agricultural history. And this was just a photo of a participant's grandparents shearing sheep in the Sperrins. And this all feeds into, the politics of erasure, where a participant talks about how, because the attitude behind that is that we're up here in the wild woods and we aren't really to be taken seriously. And you see that in other extractive struggles in Ireland, where, in the struggle against Shell in County Mayo, there's this kind of like erasure of people and relationships and things that exist in a place in order to exploit it as well. So I just want to talk a little bit, if I have time, I think.
Yeah, you should maybe kind of wrap it up here a little bit so we can still have time and plenty of question and answer. But yeah, you still got a couple minutes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'll just whiz through this last part here, because I just wanted to talk about how extractivism plays out in places and bodies, and what we're seeing here is there's a lot of like violence happening to people who are resisting in the Sperrins at the minute. There's there's been death threats, there's been assaults, there's been hit and runs, women's cars have been followed at night. And just on Tuesday, there was a report released by the CAJ into the selective policing and sort of like, how the PSNI, which is the police in the north of Ireland, has been handling the situation and criminalising protesters. But I also draw on your work, Sandra, and others who, talk about the social engineering of extractivism, and this involves, a type of like manipulation, different ways where consent is engineered, and a social license to operate, and that involves, like Dalradian employing lots of PR companies, greenwashing, a manipulation, trying to use the post-conflict situation by pitting different communities against each other. We know that as well, Dalradian have been challenged for having adverts which state that their project will be carbon neutral and essential for green transitions. So this was refuted in the Advertising Standards Agency. On their website, they talk about how they're going to support a solar power project in India, and that's why their project will be carbon neutral, even though they're going to remove 30 hectares of peatland and use 3.3 million litres of diesel. And also the fact that they tried to say that it's going to be a copper and silver mine as well, which are necessary for the transition. And that was proven false. They try to buy a social license. They have a fund where they support, schools and sports teams, and try to influence influential people in the community as well. And so just to point out as well, this is the occupation on the site where the mine would be, called the Greencastle People's Office, which is a great space for coming together and resisting. And they have a blog where you can read lots about what they're up to. And I see that as sort of building the critical infrastructure that Anne Spice talks about, of building these relationships that we want to see in the present and practicing them in these places in embodied ways. I'll also be doing counter mapping, which I'm not going to get into, but just wanted to show you some pictures from that. So be making these kind of maps of the Sperrins to show that it's not just an empty wilderness. And then finally, we've been doing lots of international solidarity visits. And we have a collaboration with Water Protectors in Turtle Island, who've been over many times. And we're going there in October to South Dakota as well. So yeah, just to share some quick photos of that. And then you've seen this picture before, but it's very important because it speaks to the kind of anti-colonial, the connecting struggles, and the different ways that we're building these relationships in the Sperrins. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and I'm sorry if I went over a little bit. There's a lot to fit in, but I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. And these are some of the groups you can follow if you're interested. So thank you so much.
All right, amazing. Yeah, I don't think, but because of the history of the IRA and other resistance in the area, I don't think anyone would ever accuse Irish of being victims, as you mentioned before. But again, wow, I think that what you're saying, keys to peace, are the open doors to extractivism. I think this is a big kind of geopolitical reflection and wisdom that from Colombia to Ireland, that is something worth to consider. But amazing presentation. Thank you so much. Cramming a lot in there. Great work.
Maybe too much.
And last but not least, or maybe the best for last, we have Lewis Fitzgerald, assistant professor from the School of Law and Government in the city of Dublin, Dublin City University. All right. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sander, for organizing, and everyone for being here. I'm just going to share my slides. I hope you can see them all fine. And I'm going to set a timer as well. I actually have 2 of them. So I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible. And I'm really happy to elaborate further in the Q&A. So I'll try and speed through it so we can get to there. My name, like Sander said, is Louise Fitzgerald, and I'm based currently at the School of Law and Government. But I also draw, as you'll kind of see, a lot on perspectives for geography. What I'm really going to talk about is very much following on from what Paddy and Vincenzo have been talking about, is forestry frontiers, and how this is another frontier of green extractivism in Ireland. So just to give you an overview, so I'm going to just briefly do kind of a review of forestry through scholarly and activist research that's already been happening. I'll talk a little bit about my approach, which is similar to Vincenzo's, of using feminist political ecology in the sort of fieldwork I've been doing. I'll then talk about what my research has found in terms of the impacts of forestry for rural communities in Ireland. And then just kind of finish with kind of a brief analysis of forestry extractivism and what it can reveal for the future. Just looking on here. So just to start with kind of a review, and I guess pay homage to the great work that's already been done in the kind of area of forestry. So as we kind of know, forestry is being promoted in the context of the climate and biodiversity crisis. This is kind of leading, as these kind of international, climate policy stimuli come into reality on the ground with people's lived experiences and livelihoods. What the work of people like Melissa Lynch and Ian Scunz have outlined is that this is leading to carbon conflicts. So it's very much contested how forestry is happening on the ground. There's been considerable contestations over, for example, programs such as RED, which Carbon Trade Watch and the Indigenous Environmental Network in particular have been reporting on and kind of elaborating the impacts, particularly for communities in the global south. And what's also been highlighted is that forestry, like many of the other things we've heard talked about today, is really a way in which land grabbing is made possible or is legitimized through these kind of green ideas or pressures, and that forestry is very much a part of this green grabbing. So I kind of very much, draw on this great work that's already been done, as well as try to situate my work in the work that's been done by people including Andrea Brock and Xander, you as well, of recognizing decarbonisation as this process of dispossession, also for communities in the global north. So even in places like Germany, which might be held up as a kind of, green hero, there's serious processes of dispossession and risks posed to people's livelihoods. So I kind of situate the work I'm doing in this kind of growing area, and really I'm trying to fill a kind of gap in policy and research knowledges as to the forestry impacts for communities in the global north, drawing on this kind of rich both activist and scholarly research that's been going on for many, many years with communities in the global south. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction before I get into it of the place that I've been doing most of my research. So the place is called County Leitrim. So I've just provided you a map there. So again, I suppose a few important things to note. It's very close to the border, particularly North Leitrim. So many of the things that Vincenza have been talking about, as well as Pat and Paddy, are really relevant here. I suppose maybe just to share I've been connected with the communities there. I'm not from there, but for about 8 years, mainly resulting from my participation in the anti-fracking movement, which was led by communities in County Leitrim and actually led to a national ban on fracking, thanks to them. So their kind of 7-year-long campaign led to one of the first international bans on fracking. So yeah, we very much have them to thank for that. So maybe just to give you a bit of an overview of the sort of forestry that I'm talking about. So predominantly it's non-native Sitka spruce plantation. So Sitka spruce is a type of tree that comes from North America. It grows pretty fast in Ireland because of our moderate climate. And these are industrial plantations. So it's like a crop of timber. It's not a forest that's just left. It's a crop of timber that's grown and then felled anywhere between maybe 20, 30, 40 plus years. And it's monoculture. So most of them are just, almost a singular tree. So previously, just to give a little background, it was mainly state-led forestry. So again, the 1960s has been kind of a kind of pivotal point where the government in Ireland tried to use forestry as a means to take kind of marginal land. So again, harking back to what Vincenza was saying, this way of seeing land and appreciating land, marginal land into more productive uses. So forestry was kind of seen as a mechanism for this. But in the last decade or so, it's actually been increasingly private actors who are participating in forestry, particular international investment funds. And again, Canada, for some reason, pops up again. So, for example, Canadian teachers' pension funds buying land in Ireland to put under forestry. And one of the main drivers for that is the grants that are provided by the state for both planting and then keeping land under forestry. And if you look at kind of the discourses in the kind of investment circles, this is seen as kind of a safe investment, free from the kind of volatile capital markets because you get a fixed payment. So very much incentivizing these kind of international actors to come in and buy land. Importantly, and kind of to link in with what's been said so far by everyone else, is there's really important kind of interwoven histories at play here in this kind of post-colonial context. So like I said, Leitrim is quite near the border, is right at the border in the case of North Leitrim, and it's been impacted also by the conflict. So that's kind of one thing we have to, I suppose, appreciate. It's a place that's experienced generations of kind of de-investment. Even if we look at kind of, again, this colonial context, the population of Leitrim is currently 35,000, whereas before the famine it was over 150,000. As well as maybe the context of the deforested landscapes of Ireland being another part that played into it. So Ireland being almost completely deforested. when it kind of came out of colonialization. And in the early 1900s, it was about 1% forestry cover. So it's also kind of an agenda of the state to increase the forestry cover in Ireland. That's kind of playing into this and kind of, informed by this history. Another thing is to say that there's multi-layered extractivisms going on in Leitrim. I mentioned fracking. One way fracking was going to come into Leitrim was using the forestry roads that existed. There's also planned gold mining, as with what Vincenza spoke about. There's now industrial wind parks being built on forestry land. So there's these kind of interlayered and interwoven extractivisms also at play, which are kind of important context to understand. So just to briefly talk about my approach, I don't think I need to get into this too much into this audience, but mainly what I use is feminist political ecology. So drawing on, those political economy insights to think about the relations between society and environmental resources, thinking about power and politics at different scales, and feminist political ecology really contributing an understanding of the kind of gendered nature of knowledge. And like Vincenza also spoke about, that environmental issues are also experienced through the scale of the body, emotions, spaces, as well as that more relational, more than human and kind of situated knowledges, bringing an appreciation to that, as well as also the importance that there's many alternatives beyond this kind of neoliberal environmentalities that are sort of forced upon us. So I draw on all these different insights and thinking about these different scales in which forestry plays out. I've conducted many field trips to Leitrim from about 2021 onwards, particularly with regards to my forestry. And so this has been many different informal conversations, walks in forests, interviews and focus groups with, at this stage, a couple of dozen people to try and gain an insight into how forestry is impacting the communities there. So just to get onto my findings, there's lots we could talk about, but just to be a bit succinct, kind of two ways I want to look at this is the kind of changing landscapes and loss of land resulting from forestry, as well as the impacts from more than human. So I'll briefly talk about this and then I'll move on to the analysis. So this is just an image from one of the places that had been felled right at the border. So really one of the main impacts is through the changing landscapes and the loss of land resulting from forestry. So thinking through, and with that kind of appreciation of the scale of the body and emotions, what many of the people I spoke with talked about is, the loss of light because trees are planted right up against someone's home, the disorientation that they feel and being actually lost in the places that they're from as a result of clear felling. So some people talk about getting lost in what was previously a forest and they knew how to get to their neighbors, but then after the clear fell, they got completely disorientated. And really speaking a lot about these visceral impacts, particularly from seeing the clear fell. So people use really quite warlike metaphors, talking about apocalyptic landscapes being left behind. Some even spoke about feeling physically sick when they see what's left behind after a clear felling has happened. So really coming through that there's this, embodied impact. Another kind of more, I suppose, from a political economy perspective, impact that's coming through is that land is increasingly being purchased by external actors, which is pushing up the price of land, and farmers are particularly impacted. So previously, land would have, if a farmer was retiring, it would have been divvied up amongst farmers in the area. And now it's increasingly just being channeled straight into forestry, into private actors. And so really people have serious concerns about the socioeconomic impacts of this and really, the possibilities of rural futures in the way that they want as a result of this, the foundation of rural economies in sense the land being removed in this way. And there's serious processes of commodification and consolidation where there's ever growing tracts of land. And if you go to these places, you see kind of a patchwork of forestry. And sometimes all you can see, as far as the eye can see, is forestry. And it's this kind of patchwork quilt that's joining together. So these are kind of some really key things that came out around kind of land and these changing landscape dynamics. The other impact, and following on from what Vincenza said, is the kind of more than human impact. So again, this is an image of forestry. You can kind of see the clear fell and the kind of the way it's, the trees have been ripped up. You can kind of see the right piece of trunk being left behind. So people speak a lot about the impacts of the more than human. And I suppose the important thing is that because Leitrim has land that isn't as suitable for certain forms of intensive agriculture. It is a place actually that's become sort of a haven for many different species that have been pushed out from elsewhere as a result of intensive agriculture. So there's many rare species and rare habitats that exist in Leitrim that don't exist elsewhere in Ireland. And people really have a sense of custodianship of these rare species and habitats in Leitrim. And they have what came through in the interviews a lot, and sometimes they spoke about the more than human before they spoke about the the community impacts or the economic impacts. It was often the thing that they first named is the concerns of the impact for these more than human creatures as a result of the monocultures and this kind of dispossession, as well as people kind of posing contrasts between the official kind of mainstream language around biodiversity crisis and then how this is allowed to happen, that there could be felling 365 days of the year, including during nesting season, and kind of all of the impacts that they see. So I think that's kind of an important one, and that's something that's revealed also through this feminist political ecology lens. So again, like I said, I can elaborate on all of these more, but I want to just hop onto the analysis in the interest of time. So I think there's kind of two ways that we can think about it. I mean, there's many other ways, but I'm trying to be succinct. And one is around dispossessions and depopulation. And again, linking into everything that's been said before about these kind of post-colonial contexts in Ireland. And then also what comes through is the many alternatives and what's revealed in the contestations around forestry in Leitrim and elsewhere in Ireland. So in terms of dispossession and depopulation, what came through really strongly around these kind of losses of land and the kind of the way in which forestry is implemented in Ireland is that forestry was sort of intersecting with and being a driver of depopulation. So like I said, this is already a place that's been impacted by, many generations in this kind of post-colonial context, has already suffered extreme depopulation, and that forestry is now becoming actually another driver of this because of the way it's changing the landscape, the way it's sort of encompassing villages, separating neighbor from neighbor, where people can no longer see neighbor households and feel very isolated and then move. One quote that came out quite starkly is that trees are simply replacing people. And there was a lot of concerns around how, because of these generational impacts of the investment and lack of opportunity for younger people, there were many people who were emigrating rather than staying in farming. So you have an older population who are owning the land. And this fear that there's an elderly population that are going to be moving on from the land, and that just swathes of land, hundreds of acres of land are going to come into, just be channeled into forestry, and what that's going to mean. And really there's dispossessions in so many different ways. It's land, soil, economic, the kind of environmental injustice of having people have very little say over how forestry is implemented. There's fees for putting in objections to planning licenses, to felling or planting licenses. So really dispossessions on many different scales and many different fronts. So just to kind of conclude and maybe to try and bring it up a bit and end in a more positive note, one thing that really came through so strongly as well is that there are many alternatives. And revealed in the contestations around forestry, you really see this clash between, abstract calculations and targets around how many trees we have to plant, and these kind of, top-down policy processes coming into clash with much more place-based connections and knowledges, like Vincenza was talking about, what come through in the amazing kind of counter maps that she's been developing. Also in Leitrim, like I said, there's many different extractivisms going on, but there's also many different resistances to extractivism. And what these people are articulating in the resistance to forestry, as well as the resistance to the different forms of extractivism going on, is really clear visions of and actions of solidarity and care. So, for example, North Leitrim has been longer affected by forestry. And the people in North Leitrim and those participating in, for example, Save Leitrim, which is one of the main resistance groups, say, we don't want to happen in the north to happen in the south of the county. So we're helping them. And equally, they don't want it to happen to other people in the rest of Ireland who, they've never met, they don't know. So they're trying to, whilst fighting many different extractivist fronts, also help others. So really, the care, like I said, that comes out for the more than human, and thinking about spatial justice, how they articulate a lot around how Leitrim has already met the 20% target that the government want for the whole of Ireland. So that it needs to be spread out a bit more, and as well as kind of intergenerational justice piece around the types of forestry that are being planted and how that's in no way serving future generations. And really, what's articulated broadly is in these kind of, I think, visions and these resistances to extractivism is a much more, you know, a very coherent vision and also like concrete solutions to more place-based regenerative futures. So I'm just going to end there, and yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to the Q&A and discussing with you more further. So thanks.
All right, Louise, thanks so much for the lovely presentation, getting into the forest extractivism. All right, so this leaves us with a square 15 minutes for question and answer. Maybe we can be 5-10 minutes late. And more importantly, I just want to stress that for all the industry representatives and people that kind of come to this, the EXALT Dialogues cannot be used for a box checking exercise or any type of participatory kind of thing to try to kind of justify like civil society engagement or anything like this. So please, I just want to put that statement out there that if you are working with industry in any way, shape, or form, this is obviously for intelligence or learning or conversation, but does not in any way, shape, or form go for engaging civil society or things like this. And so with that, and before maybe, I mean, on that note, how about, because it's been brought to my attention that Victor Correa, who's part of the CLAN, the Horizon Funding Project, is here. It'd actually be really, he's a mining engineer trying to kind of show how conservation and mining are reconcilable. I'm actually very curious and maybe want to kind of call on this since we have this, you know, this illustrious opportunity to actually see kind of what someone who's kind of in this and kind of advocating for mining might be thinking about these presentations. Thank you.
That's what I mean, trying going in and out or signal.
You're breaking up. I'm sorry, but I'm happy you're here and keep it up.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you managed because the connection seems to be really bad. But I was saying, Chandar, the main goal of my presence here is just to learn from you and to listen to different perspectives. Because as I see it, we see some politics. So I will vote or transition. On the other side, we also see that they are raising concerns about biodiversity. And making this possible, as the presentations before just pointed out, is quite difficult. And in my opinion, we can only, or we shouldn't say that this isn't our problem because we live in Europe and basically keep using the same systems that we had before. So relying on from itself, because, for instance, if it's coming from China and we don't see it, so we don't feel it. But as I said, I'm clear from the ground rule that you just mentioned. I'm not here to have some sort of greenwashing, but just to listen.
Victor, it's a shame that we can't hear you and you're breaking up, but appreciate your words and speaking up here. Maybe you're coming back now.
Thank you so much,
Chandar. All right.
Chandar,
thanks for speaking
I was saying thank you so much. Okay, because my connection is really poor, but as I said, very interesting listening perspectives, and thank you for organizing this.
Yes, thanks for speaking up, and it raises the issue of how we're kind of still kind of tied up and dependent on these kind of industrial systems that do require a lot of mining, that do require a lot of energy, and how this is a big challenge and a big issue to actually kind of challenge these kind of structural and kind of path-dependent patterns. Not to mention the ways that I think something that's actually very concerning I want to bring up is the way that there's this constant attempt to break north and south. You know, obviously the presentations in a panel in Ireland today shows that very much the south is in the north. And we can find in every country an example of the quote global south and the global north, but there's constantly an attempt to break these kind of social movement connections, to constantly break the years, decades, almost centuries of the way that people have been collaborating and in struggle against different resource extraction projects or kind of the colonial project in general. But to not take away too much from this, let's open this up for questions. And please write them into the chat. I'll read them for you the best that I can. Clearly, I can't pronounce names very well. And we have one, but please, if anyone's here, please speak up. And I hope that Ina will go on 10 minutes extra, so we at least have a good 20 minutes of question and answers right now. Please speak up if you have a relatively decent internet connection, and no video will maybe help with hearing your words. If not, please type in the chat. I mean, I have tons of questions, but I've already spoken a lot. So let's see what Jane has said. Such fascinating words. Patrick, Patty, Vicenza, Louise. I have a question for Vicenza. The chat's moving. How have the threats affected the activists and the Spearings? Is part of the community in favor of the mine? And how has this played out in the community? Vicenza, if you could take that.
I can just really briefly answer that. That I'd say the majority of the people are resisting the project. There are like a very small handful of people for it, obviously, as well. But yeah, I think the majority is involved in the resistance movement. And yeah, as I kind of mentioned in the presentation, there's been lots of impacts on people resisting, violent and more subtle kind of violence, slow violence, and emotional kind of impacts as well. There's also been a re-traumatization of people from the Troubles, where yeah, they're kind of like seeing the remilitarization of the area, and which has been really, really hard to see as well. But yeah, I'll leave it there and give space for other questions.
Great. And please raise your hand if you're here if you want to talk. Otherwise, I'm going to read Elsa. I have a question for everyone, she says. Since this type of digital eco-modernism that endorses twin transition has become increasingly hegemonic and difficult to mobilize against, what could be done to make mobilizing easier and more compelling, and bring this analysis and action to the forefront of so-called more mainstream climate justice movements? Who wants to take this? I feel like Louise or Patrick might be ready for this.
Yeah. Louise, do you want to go?
No, you can go. Sorry, there was a lot to the question, so I'm just also reading it in the chat.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, just in terms of the I can talk a little bit about the digital side of things, right? Because I think that one of the things that, like, especially, I'm in a communication studies department. I come from media studies, right? But then, like, kind of being involved in, kind of like different like activism sides around these things, right? Is I think what I've noticed is a kind of separation that I've found very few examples of, like, actually like reconciling between things like mobilization around digital rights, mobilizations about, big tech power, kind of like platform governance, things like this, and the, kind of very real, obviously, like material environmental impacts of digital systems, right? And it's getting there. And there is some, like, most, in large part, people looking at data centers, right? They are the kind of most, let's say, prominent example of where these two things, right? Digital infrastructure and the expansion of, kind of big tech power in the form of these centralized, kind of computing hubs, right? That kind of run the internet as we kind of know it, right? That, and then, the kind of direct impacts on, emissions, for example, right? You see that connection being drawn quite clearly. But I think that, yeah, like we do, like Patty and I in our work do struggle to make these points, right? That it's because I think that sometimes when you really get into the nitty-gritty of, the way that, these kinds of, especially these kinds of logics and epistemologies of extractivism are playing out in apparently innocuous arenas to people, right? Things like, how are smart metering devices, kind of like amplifying particular kinds of environmental injustice at the intersection of data collection and energy regimes, right? Like those types of things are kind of harder to articulate. And I think that one of the ways that we've been kind of pushing is kind of looking at this, not just the developmental regime in Ireland behind it, but also the kind of much more insidious logics of kind of like naturalization and naturalized privatization that come with, these kinds of backdoor mechanisms by which tech is becoming, again, central to the energy transition, or it's trying to make themselves, right? And I think it's an ongoing struggle, I guess, is the too long didn't read version of it. But yeah, I don't know if Louise, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, Elsa, thanks so much for the question. And Pat, maybe just following on from what Pat is saying, also, I think, if you look at whether it's, forestry or mining or these kind of digital infrastructures, if you look at where they're being located and the sort of resistances, there's other ways of being that also exist in those places, that are, maybe that are at risk of being dispossessed by these infrastructures because you just can't have both. But there's many different solutions, that offer, I believe, like an alternative way of doing, environmentalism, or, tackling the kind of crisis and responding to it in a very, very different way that has very, very different impacts for, the more than human, as well as the kind of other communities that live in these places. So yeah, what I try and do is, I think the more we can kind of amplify those solutions that already exist, and I suppose recognize them, or kind of join them up as a, cohesive vision for how things could be different, which they already are, but I think they just need to be platformed more. I think that can kind of really help to, mobilize and bring it a bit more to the fore, because everyone's kind of freaking out about what do we do, but actually so many of the solutions, has been said before, are already here. And I think it's just about recognizing them and kind of joining them up, to offer an alternative.
Awesome. Patrick.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's obviously a big question and a hard one, but the only thing I'd add to what Pat and Louise have said is that I think one of the things that we've found hard is that for quite a long time, it's almost like the criticism of data centers and their energy use is kind of stuck in a like a vinyl record. It's like it's on repeat in terms of the articles in the media and in some of the analysis and some of the concerns, which is the focus on emissions. And obviously emissions are huge, but because the focus has really been about data centers, energy consumption and emissions, it's also opened up space for tech sector and data centers to then be the kind of the leading edge of finding green solutions to this problem of reliance on fossil fuel and emissions. So there's far less scrutiny of things like that eco-energy park in the Midlands, and there's far less scrutiny of the ways in which these companies are, as Pat said, sort of privatizing our energy futures through these kind of stealthy public-private partnerships and these new kinds of forms of governance. And I think on one hand that's challenging for us, especially in terms of engaging with the mainstream climate movement, is that it's not just about emissions, it's about, of course, new forms of extraction and the kinds of environmental harm that causes, but it's also questions of ownership and control and democracy. And I think that's a challenge, but also an opportunity, because I think that you can expand that to questions of what does a properly democratic, just transition from below look like? What does a public, decarbonized energy future look like? That brings in kind of more stuff, and I think that that's also kind of exciting in a way, and is interesting. So that's all I'd add.
All right. And we've got a yes or no question about the state of the salmon. Oh, by David. Do we know if the Moernberg River salmon spawning beds have shown any signs of recovery?
Yeah, short answer is no, I don't. Because I know, just for context, that was the river where the peat slide that happened at that wind farm in Donegal polluted massively. It was a huge pollution event to the degree that both governments north and south of the border had to step in, including the hardline unionists of the North, who are known for denying climate change and things like this. They had to go and actually at least pay lip service to the fact that there were fears of like a near total fish kill in the Moernbeg River from the peat pollution. So yeah, David, I don't know if those salmon spawning beds have shown any sign of recovery, right? Because I do know that this was, the stories that we heard, like this is like always stuck in my head, is that the folks were telling us that people were pulling up fish from the river with gills clogged with peat, right? Which is just such a like visceral, image of, that of the, kind of horrific, environmental kind of destruction that was wrought, right, in this particular context, right? And then kind of, tying that to AWS's servers running in Dublin, right, I think has been quite a powerful way to visualize, the ways in which these impacts on the more than human world in these, kind of expanding regimes of extractivism have been playing out, right? So yeah, anyways, long story short, David, I don't know. I don't know if you have anything, if you know anything about what's been going on there. Because oh, and sorry, one more thing is that this company was only fined €1,500 for effectively destroying this entire entire ecology, right? Which is a pretty insulting amount number. But anyways, yeah, sorry, David.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
May I show you something here? Could I be allowed to share? Or have we time?
I mean, yeah.
Okay,
can you just tell us?
Okay. There's a lot of interconnection here. So the first thing I want to point out is that in local press last 30th November 23, there was an article to do with the mining Dalradian. There's a lovely picture, scenic view of a tailings pond, would you believe? However, it goes on to say that they intend to mine for other critical minerals. It was mentioned before about cobalt, etc., but they're also going after rare earth elements or rare earth metals, which are best processed at site. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. That, to me, puts at risk a very large freshwater system. I wonder if anybody has any comments to put on that.
All right, we have some.
If I can just read the metals, if I can just read the names of the metals: tellurium, antimony, bismuth, molybdenum, and of course cobalt. So
Thanks,
the region
David.
in China known as Baotao.
I can answer your question a little bit. We've got a lot of questions to go through. But rare earth element mining is rather particular.
Yeah.
But in general, there is risks of thorium, radioactive nuclides, and there are big problems if you don't process on site that you can actually be kind of spreading these things in different areas. But every mine is going to have a rather particular impact. And as we all know, rare earth elements are used in pretty much every type of digital technology, cars, cell phone, wind turbine, you name it. But I'm sorry to cut you off. I was hoping we'd have more of a clear yes or no answer to the situation with the salmon. But there's actually a number of questions here I'd like to read through. But thanks for being here and raising the issue about rare earth elements. And that is, like all these other things brought up today, super concerning. And yeah, next question. We have a plug for a policy report, and Jan Pond says, my question is, what kind of different socioeconomic structures are needed to enable a less extractivist green digital transition on national, international level? Do the speakers have any practical framework for thinking about this? All right, so Senza.
Can I jump in? It's something I wanted to get to at the end of my presentation as well. And sorry I didn't, but just to link in with what Louise was saying, I wanted to highlight there's actually Caroline White from FASTA, which is a brilliant organisation in Ireland working on economic justice and degrowth. And there's also people here involved in the Rights of Nature campaign. There's so many different like non-extractive alternatives that like people on the front lines in Ireland are working on. And I just wanted to highlight that, that there's like Rights of Nature, degrowth, Wellbeing Economy Initiative, agroecology models, so many different things are being put forward, and I think we really need to listen to those voices that are coming from the front lines in our climate justice movements. So thanks.
Excellent, thank you. And really quick, because I didn't mean to cut it off too fast, but I do want to get into these Does anyone on the panel have anything they want to say about rare earth element mining? And as Victor wrote in the chat, it's true that the majority, if not all of these, are processed in China as we speak.
Can I just say quickly in relation to the mine in the Sperrins that the application is for a gold mine? So whenever Dalradian talk about copper and silver and all the different things that they're mentioning now, that's not actually in their application. So it's kind of like a greenwashing tactic, I think. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, this is a big issue about how the green energy transition, as it's called, is actually being used to list other metals used for different consumer practices, but more so the military and so-called security services.
Just one intermission there. I do believe that they are not going to ignore them when they come across them. They will try to process. That is my fear. Sorry, that's it.
All right. Thanks, David. And then Victor coming back in, he says, thanks to the presenters and to Xander for organizing this session. Very kind. I'd like to have your views on material and energy demand caused by the growing world population, meaning that even if energy and material consumption per capita is smaller, we would still need to extract and use more natural resources. And they continue. And on top of the growing population, we have the Sustainable Development Goals calling for more material intensity. So the issue of population is brought up again. I'm happy to speak to this, but I think more importantly, I'd love to give our panelists a respond.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to come in there, and well, there's probably other stuff to say, but I mean, just following on from what Vincenza said, like, I think, you know, it's not to do with the world population, it's to do with the economic model and the relations between society and the environment that we have. You know, that's how I would understand it. And like Vincenza said, you know, we can assume that we'll continue to have, more extractive and demand for materials if we continue to buy into this economic model that we're currently in. But like Vincenza said, there's many, many alternatives already existing, and people doing, you know, great work on this that offer, a different way of doing things that really, you know, would lead to more well-being, even in the, and, you know, both societal and environmental in the context of a growing world population. And maybe just very briefly to speak to, for example, in Leitrim, where I've spoken about, you know, they had like 5 times the population, and they lived in a much more, environmentally friendly way. You know, even as of a generation ago, the older people there talk about how there used to be so much salmon in the rivers that they would just wade into the river, put out their hands and have a salmon. And they talk about how things like industrial forestry, and the kind of the runoff from the Clearfell has decimated the rivers. So we kind of really very much, even in that one minute example, see how the ways of relating to the environment and this kind of, you know, capitalist-driven industry has led to these environmental impacts. But it doesn't have to be that way. And there are many, many alternatives, like we've already spoken about, and we see that all the time in the research that we're doing in a very, very concrete, real way. So yeah, I think it's just about no longer buying into the kind of the dominant economic model and recognizing that there's alternatives coming from the grassroots and many, many different people working on this in a very meaningful, real way, that would enable us to, navigate these challenges.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel want to speak to the old population question being brought up here?
I think Louise answered it there. I just had one thing, which is like the figures that we quoted in our presentation, I think are good response to that. The thing about world population is something about world population. Like data centers will consume 30% or more of electricity on the grid in the next few years. Like, what are data centers for? I mean, of course, there is some utility of, digital automation and, cloud storage and all of these things. But by far, the clearest driver of the expansion of digital capitalism and the infrastructures required for that are a few very powerful companies that are kind of, falling over each other to find new markets for their products. They are not at all things that we need, that we socially need. They are not at all things that we have collectively determined are useful. They are things that are only happening because they have some speculative chance of being profitable for these companies. So I think probably more than in any other area, we can look at digital capitalism and the complete contradictions that are in that model in terms of questions of like energy demand and population and what it is that's driving this stuff.
Thank you. And yeah, I just like to throw on that really quick, Victor. I think the problem is usually when someone brings up population, this is tagging on to what is typically a racist trope and a way for people in the global north to just constantly try to figure out, and which links to sterilization programs, which links has a very, very, one of the most brutal, disgusting histories in the world. So and this isn't to say that population isn't something worth talking about, but it is typically 9 out of 10, if not 8 out of 10 times in my weird statistics, constantly attached to racist tropes of actually how to intervene in the global south, how to control the quote brown horde, you name it. And I think the important thing here, which I think is what's been said by the panelists, is that no matter how you cut the cake, consumption is always going to be the primary factor in problem. Yes, if you have more people, this is going to raise consumption, but the modes by which people produce, consume, and extract are always going to be more significant. And hence the stereotypical or the silly statistics I'm sure we could actually show are much worse. One person from the United States or from France or from somewhere in Europe consumes as much as 1 to 20 people in the global south. So the issue of population will always be secondary, even if it's still an issue. But I think it's more serious, as I think our panelists showed very well, that consumption is a big issue. And this will lead me to one of my questions I have for you. I have so many questions. I think Ireland is such an interesting case, specifically considering its history of colonization. But since we're on Zoom right now, and since we are in the academic circuit, yeah, everyone here's in the academic circus. So what do you think about this shift during COVID, where everyone's like, yeah, we need to be environmentally friendly, don't fly, go digital, let's do this, this is going to be great. And so now there's this kind of complete romanticization and this idea of digital infrastructure, energy use, and these things as the solution. Not to mention something for me in here that was a bit lacking, Patrick Brody was touching on it a little bit, is actually the extractive supply webs that are behind producing these different kind of rare earth producing these different digital technologies, smart technologies, and which I know there isn't much work on. But I would just like to ask everyone on the panel, what do you think about this kind of shift towards this kind of consumer politics and putting it all on the internet, putting it all on kind of these type of interfaces that we're on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really, obviously like that's the kind of like poor tension, right? And I think that a lot of people who've been looking at, the kind of environmental impacts of, kind of digital capitalism specifically for quite a while now are very much, again, like as Patty kind of gestured towards as well, like where it's like emissions is almost like a trap, right? Because it's something that the industry, you're almost like playing on the industry's ground there, right? If they're, because they get to kind of talk about emissions, which is calculable for them, right? Like there are already these like, kind of legal and financial mechanisms by which they can, effectively, kind of mitigate their at least reported impacts, right? Versus the resource intensivity period, right? Where you see, like there's like, the lawsuits against tech companies, from victims of mining in the Congo, in the DRC and stuff like this, right? Like there's these, kind of other points of focus that I think for a lot of people are much more productive than, kind of, again, focusing on like, climate and environmental impacts, as I was kind of talking about. But that book that I gestured towards at the start of the presentation by Ann Pasick and Cindy Lin, Zane Griffin, Tally Cooper, and Jordan Kinder, Digital Energetics Anne has a really nice chapter in that where she talks about this, whatever the imaginary of digital efficiencies, right? Kind of compounding and, kind of like offsetting and, making any sort of form of consumption, less resource intensive or energy intensive, whatever, always hits a material fundamental limit when tied to regimes of growth, expanding computation and things like this, right? Because of, basic, kind of like physical constraints, right? On just how efficient computing can be and things like this, right? So I think that that's something that increasingly, again, we are seeing this with AI, where it's no matter how much that might make certain things more efficient, it might, it's a silver bullet for sustainability, as it's kind of called by a lot of industries. No matter what, when it is tied to regimes of growth, right, of capitalist growth, it will require kind of expanding cloud computing infrastructures, right? So again, it's the Xander, you kind of hit the nail on the head there in your kind of suggestion that it is always going to require this kind of expanding resource intensivity. So yeah.
Anyone else want to speak to that? It turns out we actually had more time than I thought we had to talk. Because sometimes the EXALT Dialogues are an hour and a half, and it was put on to be longer. Does anyone want to speak to any of these things that have been talked? We got a lot going on in the chat.
Just one from Patrick there. Do we have any idea how much the demand is likely to increase year on year, and both for data storage and the amount of power it uses?
I mean, in the Irish context, the predictions are, primarily tied to data center expansion, where it's, the prediction is by what the International Energy Agency says by 2026, it'll be 30 data centers will use 32% of Ireland's electricity. The Air Grid stepped in, and which is the Irish grid operator, and said, no, that's not true. It'll actually be by 2030 or 2028 or something, right? But still gesturing towards the fact that there is this expectation that the infrastructure will continue to need to expand here specifically in Ireland. But more broadly, they say, there's you can find the numbers, it's pretty widely reported at this point, specifically around artificial intelligence growth. But again, it's kind of as we were talking about there in terms of like consumption and things like this, right? It's I think there's this tendency to put it on like, consumers, and a lot of times you get people saying like, how do I use less cloud storage? Like that's what I can do from my position, right? But it's the point that we always try to make is that this is about these expanding regimes of big tech capitalism, right? This is about their business models that are not being direct, they're entirely profit driven, right? And dependent upon, these extractive supply chains that are, again, kind of geographically expanding at all points. Patty, I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
No, not really. Except I've just having some thoughts about I guess a few of the questions and comments that have come up. And Pat and I were at a conference that was organized a few weeks ago online, that was on the inevitability of AI, or sort of questioning the inevitability of AI. And I do think that that's like, a really big part of this, which is that, from so many different angles and places, it's just the sort of ideological consensus is that this will continue to grow, and that there will be more automation, there will be more machine learning, and so it's just a question of like figuring out how we can harness more, renewable energy or low carbon energy to sustain that. And I think that like in terms of a politics, that like whatever our alternative is, or whatever where the resistance is, it has to be not just challenging, but figuring out how to address that consensus and how to address that question, which is always there, which is always like, not just that you can't stop it, but also thinking about things like the kind of individualized responses of like, oh, it's because you're on your phone too much, or whether you fly less, or whether you go on less Zoom meetings, whatever it is. I mean, like there hasn't been a lot, I think, of ways. I mean, I know it's starting to happen more, thinking about ideas of like public ownership of compute, in the same way that there's discussions about public ownership of energy. Those are not that convincing to me at the moment. Thinking about maybe more democratic forms of public ownership and like public commons ownership of infrastructure. But I do think that there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done around that. rather than it just being a question of, and certainly Pat and I, a lot of what we do is just pointing out how, crazy this is and how harmful it is, rather than thinking about, okay, so, what might the different sort of directions be, or other ways of thinking about technology in more collective, flourishing ways, in the same way that you see maybe agroecology in the context of critiques of capitalist agriculture. Like, what does it look like in terms of technology and data and so on? Yeah, that's all I'd add there.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. So Caroline White didn't ask a question, so I won't read it, but there's a general appreciation for y'all, especially for mentioning fiestas. Fiestas is the Irish word for from now on or in the future. So I think that's a fun one that got missed, probably because Rush and everyone over here. Could Patrick or Patty say something about community-owned wind energy, which is almost non-existent in Ireland, and about the potential for activists to push for more of it?
Yeah, I could say something. It's true. It almost doesn't exist. And if you look at like Scotland or other places, there is a lot more community-owned wind infrastructure. That is because here the model that was pursued was very much about developer-led, market-led energy development. And so a lot of what the state has done has sought to enable large energy developers and their investors to sort of develop wind energy and solar. And that means that it's almost impossible for communities to compete for sites. They have no supports in terms of access to low interest finance or no interest finance. The kinds of expertise in terms of engineering and planning, all that stuff, you can't expect communities to have all of that. And so it needs to be supported by the state in some way. And so I definitely think there could be a push for it. I think because it hasn't existed here, it's not really on the table. I think where you see politics around wind energy is very much in terms of objecting to wind farms, as opposed to communities mobilizing to build and own and control their own infrastructures. But I think that it would have to, be part of this model or this idea of a public commons, which is something that's been developed in the UK by the Abundance group that people should definitely look up. So they're trying to develop this model of public commons partnerships, or PCPs, which are kind of in one way you can think about it in Ireland, where we have such a dominance of public-private partnerships, which are just about the state facilitating and de-risking private investment and development. A public commons partnership would be about a state facilitating a kind of democratization of the economy through common ownership, and the sort of benefits and wealth produced through those activities and infrastructures staying in those communities. So similar to community wealth building. And I definitely think in Ireland there's a lot of space for that. And there are organizations like FASTA, working on those kinds of ideas as well. But I think if that could link up with those more antagonistic, kind of campaigns and places, thinking about the forestry and Leitrim that Louise mentioned, or lots of places where people are basically, sacrifice zones or being, screwed by large infrastructural projects. They want infrastructure and they want things to be going on there. It's just that there isn't a model there or a framework, and there isn't, certainly not the political will. So I think if you could develop something like PCPs, develop something like community wealth building as a way to sort of hold those different projects together and maybe create a bit of a platform around it, I think that would be exciting.
All right. And Victor, hopefully you've got better internet connection.
Yes, hopefully yes, because now I'm already out of the train. Chandy, because of that reply that we just heard and the question before, I wonder, so if we transform the economic model, for instance, in the case of mining, And if the population is, instead of being just affected by mining, in case they are becoming shareholders of the mine, so they are the owners of the mine, and the mine products are shared by everyone, will that make it more acceptable in your view? And that's the question to the group. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that. We see where you're going here with the old trying to make mining working. Who wants to speak to this? Luis, you got something for this?
I mean, I guess this echoes a bit with, let's say, wind energy, which also has come up. And I guess it's this problem with, like, which comes up a lot with, social license to operate. And the assumption is that the project is going to happen anyway. And then it's like, okay, it's going to happen. So how do we, maybe mitigate its impacts, like, let's say, through providing some sort of community benefit. But I think a lot of what we're speaking to today is this idea that, like Patty talked about with the wind energy, like the communities, they want infrastructure, but they want to determine what that sort of infrastructure is going to be. And they want it to be, place-based and sensitive to the cultural context, the environmental context, the things they care about. And I think I think that's kind of where we need to be coming from, right? It's not that a mine is going to happen or a wind project is going to happen or whatever. And then it's like we distribute the benefits to make it better for people. But like fundamentally, if that community doesn't want the project in the first place, no amount of distributing the benefits is going to make up for the harm caused by the project. So I think it's kind of a reorientation again and kind of appreciating again these kind of local specificities, what the people actually want. Rather than saying, okay, the project's going to happen and they're going to get some benefits, so isn't that great? It's more like determining what sort of infrastructure they want for their communities and recognizing that it's often, generations, decades, hundreds of years of the investment of, post-colonial contexts that have contributed to people maybe being in a position where, infrastructure is scarce. So at the very least now, hopefully we can use transition as a chance for people actually to determine their own futures and what they want to happen in their community and to kind of heal those past harms, rather than kind of forcing new infrastructure projects on them, scrambling over the crumbs rather than determining what they want to happen for their future. And like I said, many of these communities already have the vision, and that's why they're resisting these projects, not because they're only against things, but because they're actually for alternatives. And I think that's really, really important to note. And maybe Patty wants to come in.
Yes, thank you.
Patrick?
Yeah, it just makes me think again about what Vicenza and Louise had said about, the coloniality of these projects and the idea of there being sort of nothing there to begin with, and then a project comes in and then it tries to sort of mobilize support or give community benefit funds or whatever. Whereas, like, certainly my experience of going to different parts of Ireland, where these projects come in is that, you just have to scratch a little bit. And what you usually find is that there have been initiatives that are, grassroots, that are from those communities to get projects off the ground for years, if not decades. And it's not just in rural context, it's also in urban context. I'm doing work around retrofitting where, people have been asking for stuff, if not demanding stuff, for a long time, and they haven't been listened to. Or if they have been supported by local authorities or organs of the state or whatever, it's in very piecemeal ways. And then after all of that work, suddenly this large project comes in and it gets green lighted and it gets all of this support and financial support and so on, and it happens. That's the kind of dynamic that we're talking about here. And so if you understand that dynamic, well, then you can understand very well why people are not going to support that big project, very often. And I think that points to this idea, say, with the public commons partnership or whatever, of democratizing the economy and democratizing the transition, where you start with where people are and what their needs are, and you develop institutions and ways of meeting those needs in a collective way and in a fair way. That is the way to build the transition and for there to be support for a transition.
Awesome. Vicenza?
Yeah, thank you, Louise and Patty. I agree with everything you said. Just to add on to that, and I know Diego's here as well, that communities absolutely have the right to say no, and it's also like not always like possible or within the capacity to come up with all the alternatives as well. Like, I think it's very exhausting, and there's a lot of slow violence involved of like resisting these huge projects. And I just wanted to raise that the right to say no in and of itself is important to bring up.
Excellent. All right, we're coming to the end here. Yeah, there's only 1 minute, but I would just like to summarize at least that there still is this issue of really, one, the way that there is an entire apparatus, an entire kind of process of kind of manufacturing demand. We always talk about supply and demand. Where does this come from? But there are some of the largest kind of budgets, and I think some of the degrowth people have highlighted this again, that some of the largest budgets for companies are public relations, are advertising in a way to entice people, not to mention developing products that are designed to fail with planned obsolescence, or even now planned obsolescence 2.0, which is actually really getting into people's minds to fit certain consumer patterns and really thriving off different kind of insecurities that have been generated through school displacement, separated from families, pretty much the loss of kind of connection to the land. There's a lot of different theories we can take in terms of where these emotional black holes come from that are filled with consumerism, drugs, violence, you name it. But there is this enduring issue of where is the energy demand coming from? Do we really want 5G? Do we really need data centers? Are we really this addicted and suffering technophilia? Are we not talking about technophilia or techno addiction as a public health problem? So there is the manufacturing of demand and the structures that are doing this. And I think what was just said very well here is the fact that the solutions are already here, as Peter Gelderloos's book said, looking at grassroots movements, as Vicenza and a lot of the presentations here today. There are the solutions. People are doing these things. There are, even if they can be done well, which they can, but often aren't, there are amazing community microgrid, wind turbines, solar projects, that could be used in a constructive and responsible way, but are often systematically blocked, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in Ireland or different countries. Even Denmark's doing it. They were the ones that had the Danish model, and now they are breaking from this and going for this large corporate utility scale way of doing it. But these are blocked by state regulations and things like this. So there are very clear obstructions. And on top of that, the fact that, as Patrick showed us, that really, this idea of foreign direct investment, this institutionalization of settler colonialism, of actually bringing in capitalist and extractive values and encouraging the selling off of the lands and things like this, that really there is this legally mandated and structurally encouraged set of values that is ultimately about destruction and taking the land. And these aren't the constructive ways of actually resource management, co-development, and maybe some of the things that Victor is trying to play and kind of dabble with within this framework, where there are seriously structural issues that for at least a century now have been repressed violently and refused to address. And we're still here today. So those are some of my main takeaways that I'm getting from this. I want to give a last word to our 4 panelists before we move on, before this has to end. But yeah, does anyone, Patrick, Vicenza, anything to say? Last words, shout outs, shutdowns?
No, just wanted to say thanks for organizing, and thanks.
Yeah.
Had a really good time, and yeah, it's great to have this space and get to chat with everybody about this. So yeah, thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining and listening and your questions and inputs. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
No, thank you to all of you. Thank you to the EXALT Initiative, Barry, Marcus, Anya, everyone who made it possible. Elena, thanks so much for being here, and everyone for coming, and so much the 4 of you. Thank you so much for sharing what's going on in Ireland and these kind of crazy intersections that I look so much forward to seeing what kind of comes out of this. And everyone, yeah, thanks for being here, Victor. Thanks for your words and your interest in sticking your neck out there. All right, y'all. Thanks for coming. Ciao.
Thank you. See y'all.
How do I end recording? There. Stop. Oh no, I don't think I did.